would you say are the most common gaps that you see? Is it gaps in personnel? Is it gaps in systems? Or does it vary on who you're working with?
I think the biggest gap that exists in organizations is the gap between the leader's vision of what they're trying to do and their organization's understanding of it. You know, as entrepreneurs and leaders, sometimes we just start businesses because we don't want to work for other people, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk Tails.
My guest today on Tales with Taylor knows that real growth requires leaders to have the courage to face uncomfortable truths. He is the founder of Gap View Business Advisors, specializing in identifying and resolving performance gaps that prevent businesses from reaching their full potential. With over 30 years of experience across diverse industries, my guest has helped companies achieve transformational results, from launching category-defining brands to turning around struggling operations. His track record includes a converting of $500,000 loss to a $1.5 million profit. He works hands-on with leadership teams to uncover root causes of underperformance and implement practical, results-driven solutions that create measurable growth and operational efficiency. It's Paul Sim. How are you doing today?
Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me on the show, Taylor.
Well, thank you so much for being here. So why do you feel leaders, can't handle the truth sometimes?
Well, I think we all have a tendency to tell ourselves stories. We tell ourselves and other people stories about our business that may not be exactly true. Sometimes it kind of skirts around the edges because we, especially in like a networking event or something, we start to talk about ourselves and our business in ways that we want people to imagine us, as opposed to ways that's actually the truth. And that's probably okay. I mean, there's a bit of marketing associated with that. But as soon as those stories start to become your own truth, that's when it really starts to get dangerous. And the other thing that happens with leaders is they can easily ignore the feedback and data they get from customers, from their employees, from their organization about issues that they feel uncomfortable with. That's just because George is just a complainer, right? Or, I'm not sure we want to keep these folks as customers anyhow because they're always whining and complaining. But instead of really listening and hearing and trying to understand what that feedback is telling you about your organization. So listen, if a leader in an organization wants to go through a transformation, wants to go from where you are now to where you want to be, you have to really be prepared to face the truth and the reality about what's going on in your organization. And that's a great first step, but you have to be prepared for it and have the courage to do it.
Yeah, and then, it reminds me of one of my clients, Kathy Dempsey. She talks about having to shed and how, lizards will shed their skin, and how as leaders, we need to be willing to shed old identities or old beliefs in order to get to that, new outcome or that goal that you're trying to get to.
That's absolutely right. You have to face your reality. You have to own your reality. You have to acknowledge that the issues that are going on in your business aren't always a function of the fact that you hired the wrong people. That, we have some customers that we don't enjoy dealing business with. Some of those issues are because as a leader, you haven't sat down and created a structure and a system and a process that allows your organization to work together effectively and move forward smoothly. And so that's really where we try to engage with organizations. And really before we jump into saying, well, let's map a bunch of processes, let's do all those kinds of things, we really start with saying, let's really understand what's going on in the business first. Turn to your customers, turn to your employees, and let's really drill down and be brutally honest with ourselves about what the challenges and issues are that we have to face.
And what would you say are the most common gaps that you see? Is it gaps in personnel? Is it gaps in systems? Or does it vary on who you're working with?
I think the biggest gap that exists in organizations is the gap between the leader's vision of what they're trying to do and their organization's understanding of it. You know, as entrepreneurs and leaders, sometimes we just start businesses because we don't want to work for other people, right? Yeah. And that can be fine, and that'll get us some work, and that'll get us some jobs. Sometimes we start businesses because we have some vision of what we think we can do in the world or for the world that is motivating us. But eventually, as we grow, as we start to hire people and create systems and structures around that, unless the leader's vision is clear to the rest of the organization, then they're forced to make decisions on a day-to-day basis, sort of blind, right? So the real critical part and the real critical gap to fill, I find, is that there has to be this coming together of what I refer to as radical agreement or radical clarity within an organization that isn't just, oh yeah, that sounds good, we should do that. It's, yeah, wow, that is absolutely going to change the world and we need to do that.
So it's getting like company buy-in, not just from the leaders, but from every person a part of the organization.
And I'm not sure buy-in is important. Yeah. I feel like that's kind of soft.
Okay.
It's really, it needs to go past buy-in. Buy-in sounds like, oh yeah, I kind of,
sure, we
I
can
think
go
we
that
should
way.
do that. We should go that. Yeah. And
versus clarity and of understanding.
Versus, yeah, wow, we really need to make that happen. For instance, think of a problem. So there's one way to look at a problem and say, yeah, I think that really is an issue. And Joe, you mentioned a solution over here. We should give that a try. Let's give that a try. Versus the idea of saying, oh, wow, you're absolutely right. The data shows that is really a problem. Our team has gotten together and we've seen that that's really, really a problem. And we need to fix that tomorrow. What can I do to help? That, for me, goes a little bit beyond just buy-in.
Yeah.
It's really about I'm committed. It goes beyond buy-in to commitment. We're committed to working together to achieve these outcomes, which we all believe are important to our customers and maybe even to the world.
You know, I've heard you mention before that every, organization and business has a North Star. Can you share, what is a North Star in terms of business?
When I communicate with people, I say, we're going to help you fix your system so you can scale profitably, right? And that can go a lot of different directions. But the North Star is we're here to bring your organization together. We want to help you gain that radical agreement, that radical commitment within your organization that's really going to get everyone excited and motivated to move forward. So that's our North Star. We want to bring organizations together to achieve commitment and clarity and motivation, right? So what's your organization's Net Star? Why do you exist? What value are you going to try to transfer, or are you transferring to your customers that makes their lives better, that makes their employees' lives better, that makes the communities better? What is that value that you bring to your community and to your customers? And, usually when we start, because we have discussions with clients about this, when we start these discussions, what they say when we start is usually completely different than what they're saying when we get to the end. And it's usually an evolution, and often that North Star that we can help clients discover is a collaboration of the team coming together to agree on, and not just the leader, but the leader and the team coming together to agree on, yeah, that really is our brand promise. That's how we're different from other people in this business, and that's a clear expression of the value that we're going to bring to our clients.
And by having that clear North Star, it's like a map that as, team members are making decisions, they can think back, will that guide us to that North Star, or is that diverting perhaps from that?
Or even when we're looking at an opportunity, so many of us look at every person we meet is a prospect, right? Every company or individual that we engage with has the potential to do business with us. But if you have clarity around that North Star, around what really is the value that we deliver, who can we help the most, then that really also helps to create more meaningful conversations and the opportunity to say no, right?
Yeah.
Because saying no to a prospect
can be really tough.
It can be tough, but it can also add tremendous value to your organization and to them. Because if you engage with a client or a customer and it's really not the fit that it should be, but you say, well, they're, as a consultant or a coach, they're willing to pay me $2,000 a month, and I could sure use, or $5,000 or $8,000 or whatever your number is, and I could sure use that right now. But eventually you get down the path and it's like, well, this really isn't going anywhere. I'm not adding value to the client. They're probably not getting value from me because we never really connected on what that value is that we deliver. And as soon as you get clarity on that, then you're also going to attract the kinds of people that you can really help as well. We struggled with that. We've changed a lot about the Gap View, even from a year ago, simply because we really discovered that what we're good at is helping companies go through transformations, go through a point where they're struggling to scale their business, where they're struggling with disconnection amongst their teams, to a point where their people, processes, and systems are working together and they can scale profitably. And once they're there, they may not need us.
Yeah.
They can probably do the stuff on their own. It becomes operational after that. And so, if client relationships go away after a certain period of time because we've helped them achieve that transformation, that's fine.
You're almost like that app that's supposed to be deleted, right? We're supposed to not have to work with them eventually.
Right.
And so I want to kind of go back to young Paul for a minute. Were you like a little kid dreaming of helping businesses become, more efficient? Or what were some of your young dreams?
No. My young dream was I was going to be a jazz saxophone player.
Oh, very cool.
So, yeah, I was raised on a farm in Saskatchewan. Cute, kind of, maybe a cute story. My brother and sister were quite a bit older than me, and so they were off to college by the time I was, 10, 11 years old. Mm-hmm. And I started to learn to play saxophone when I was 8 or 9 years old. So I'd come home from school, and I'd practice my saxophone. Sometimes I'd have to go out and help on stuff on the farm, but I spent quite a bit of time on my own and a lot of time with my saxophone. And when I was 12 or 13 years old, I went to this jazz camp, and I discovered Charlie Parker and John Coltrane. And I loaded up on these records, Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, Cannonball Adderley, and I'd take them home, and we had this old stereo, with the scratchy needle on it, and I'd put that on and I'd play along with these records. Not, well, but I'd try.
Yeah, hey.
And so I ended up going to college to study music.
Wow.
And then after a year in college, I realized, wow, this might be a way to ruin a really good hobby. and plus I had interests in other things I discovered, like economics, like business and stuff like that. So my career kind of evolved into a completely different path than where I thought I was going to be when I was growing up.
Yeah, well, I bet that, it's great that you recognize that. And, the fun thing is with your business is that you're industry agnostic. You get to work with so many different types of industries that you probably get to, wet your toes a little bit of being all in these different realms.
Well, and, I've had quite a bit of experience in different industries. So straight out of college, I worked with some other farm boys who, at the early stages of the personal computer business, thought it would be great to write software for the farm applications. So, we made that surprisingly a success and sold it eventually to the Farm Credit Corporation in Canada. And then, I got into a situation where we had a wife and kids and mortgage, and it's like, well, steady income might be kind of a good thing, right? So then I got involved in the farm and construction equipment business with one of the larger manufacturers, transitioned from there into the emergency vehicle business.
Oh, wow.
That's how we ended up in the U.S. because I was running the Canadian branch of a U.S. company who had a head office here in the U.S., and they offered me a vice president's job. So we ended up moving into the U.S. But then a few years after that, it was interesting as I thought my dream was, I want to be like CEO of a Fortune 500 company and, all those things. And I found it as I got further and further up the scale of those big organizations, it became more political, it seemed less kind of relationship.
A lot more red tape.
Yeah, more sort of red tape, and I just wasn't really enjoying it. So then we switched back into the entrepreneurial phase, and I bought a business. That's how we ended up in Phoenix. It was in the emergency vehicle sector, which I transitioned out of in 2007. And then, gosh, I'm giving you my whole life story.
I love this. This is perfect. Yeah.
I did a little bit of this kind of work in 2007 and ran into some folks that had invented a solar-powered robot for cleaning swimming pools. And so we created a company called Solar Pool Technologies, which I thought was going to be, $500,000 investment in a 5-year project turned into $1 million investment in a 12-year project, and lots of struggles along the way, including facing, personal and company bankruptcy and trying to work through those issues at some point. So, and we eventually grew it and took on some partners that had financing, and we were able to grow it, and we sold it a couple of years ago to one of the larger pool product manufacturing companies. So it's been kind of that range of corporate and entrepreneurial experience that has given me, I feel, some insight that can help organizations think through challenges and also understand that whatever challenge you're facing, it's all solvable.
Yeah.
It's all solvable.
And I feel like you've given yourself the permission to pivot. Sometimes people just get so stubborn and stuck in the weeds and feel that they have to struggle their way out of the weeds. But it seems like, when you ran into a scenario, you're like, I don't like this anymore. You gave yourself the permission to pivot. Was that something that just came naturally innate in you, or did someone tell you, or?
Well, no, I don't know. It's interesting you ask that question. I haven't really done the self-analysis on that to say what. Sometimes the pivots came about because I failed at what I was doing, and so you.
But at least you
have to find a different. You have to find a different path, and that's an important part too that I think entrepreneurs are always going to face is. You have to use failure as a transition point or as a springboard, as a opportunity to say, okay, well, that didn't work. But what did I learn from it?
Yeah.
What did I learn about myself? That's probably the most important question. And what does that mean about the next step in my life, in my business career, in whatever? So you need to figure out a way to I heard somebody say this isn't original, but failure is just an outcome that's different than the one you planned.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So we all have outcomes that we didn't plan for, right?
Yeah, it was a surprise. It just wasn't a good surprise.
Right.
When my client
And so
Ramsey Bergeron, he's like, "You like surprises? Okay, well now you've broken even a tire that's down. That's a surprise, but it's not a surprise you wanted."
So it's just an outcome that's different than the one you planned for. So you just need to accept it that way and move forward from there. And so many of the times the reason organizations struggle with pivot or transition points is because they're afraid of failure. So you have this gap between, I'm not happy with where I am, right? I want to be over here. I want to be someplace different. But I'm kind of comfortable with where I am. I mean, it's not maybe that bad, right?
Right, more predictable, change.
And I'm really afraid that if I change my process structure, if I implement some new systems, if I get my team together and find out that they're really unhappy about stuff, that it's going to mess up what we got and it's going to lead to failure. And so that fear of failure puts us in this inertia situation where we just don't do anything. So we just, when leaders get to that point where I call it an inflection point, where they're really frustrated over where themselves or their organization is and where they want to be, and that gap has just gotten so big that it's just a huge frustration. There's kind of 3 paths you can go. One is you can say, well, where we are is not so bad.
Yeah.
It's like, and so you just get comfortable and say, well, maybe that objective I had over there was just unrealistic.
It's just a pie in the sky.
Yeah, just a pie in the sky. Yeah. Maybe I just need to get happy. And, sometimes that's okay. If that's really what your comfort level is, that's fine. But that's one way of reducing the gap, right?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I'm just going to change my expectation, and now the gap doesn't feel so uncomfortable. So another way of changing the gap is you can say the lies we tell ourselves, right? It's like, oh, well, we're actually doing way better than what my employees say, what our customers say, than what the financial statements say, I think we're actually doing quite a bit better. So instead of changing the gap by, oh, I'm going to reduce expectations, you change the gap by, oh, I'm going to tell lies to ourselves in our organization, right, so that I feel better about where we're at. We're not any different place, but I just feel better about it, right? It just feels better. So that's another way you can close the gap. The other way to close the gap is you say, well, okay, there's some hard work associated with getting from here to here, and let's do the hard work, right? Let's get the team together and figure out what that work is and do that hard work.
And what is your suggestion of runway of change? So what I mean by that is if you're going to implement a new system, how many months or how long do you feel someone should truly work at it and implement it to see if that change is closing the gap?
Sometimes you just have to try stuff, right? You can manage the risk. There's always risk associated with making change, and you can manage that risk. But you should be monitoring stuff. One of the key parts of a system is you need to measure, right? Yes. So you need to figure out, we call it our guidance system. In a business, you have to have your guidance system, which is your leadership and how you're measuring outcomes. And you need to figure out what outcomes are important and how we're going to measure them. But once you make a change, you need to be measuring the progress on that change on a regular and ongoing basis.
So when you say regular, does that mean monthly?
It kind of depends. If it's a change in a manufacturing facility and you're changing your product, you probably need to measure it hourly.
Okay.
So it kind of depends on what the change is and where it happens in your organization. And the measurement, the frequency of that measurement needs to match up with whatever that process change really is. Let me use an example. I'm implementing an ERP system. How do you know whether that ERP system is actually achieving the outcomes you want? And a lot of people get 6 months into an ERP implementation. It feels like this isn't working very well.
Right.
Well, they never sat down at the beginning and said, what are our success criteria? If we're going to implement this ERP system, how are we going to measure whether or not it's being successful going down the road? What are the things we're trying to fix, the problems we're trying to solve in our organization? And with that, and how are we going to measure it? So put those measures in place and then monitor it on an ongoing basis. In the case of an ERP system, it's probably monthly, maybe weekly, depending on the issue, to see, okay, is work flowing through the system more effectively? Are people adapting it? Are they using it? And you can find ways of measuring all those things. But you can't wait 6 months down the road and say, geez, it feels like things haven't changed very much.
Right. So you need to have those KPIs or key performance indicators ahead of time to then, know what to look for and take note of.
And get the team to agree on it. It's not just, hey, we're implementing this ERP system. Here's what we're going to do. Is if you want a successful any kind of change, but systems change, CRM, ERP, whatever it is. If you really want it to be successful, you need to get the team to come together around that. And the change that's agreed on may be different than the one you expected, but the change that is agreed on by the team, I guarantee, is going to be way more successful than the one you try to impose on them.
Because you have the radical buy-in, or not radical buy-in, but radical commitment.
Radical clarity, radical commitment, radical agreement on how to move forward. Absolutely.
And so I feel like it's fairly obvious how you chose GapView as the name, but I always love to know the why behind a brand. And so, I'd love to know a little bit more about what made you choose green and, your color schemes and then the arrows. And I know you also have a rocket ship involved with the brand. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your brand development of GapView.
So the farm I told you about that I was raised on in Saskatchewan.
Was it a livestock farm?
It was a mixed grain farm and cattle farm. We had a cow-calf operation and grew grain. And the district that it was located in was the Gapview district.
Oh, no way.
And so when it was first settled, that area, there was a set of hills. You don't have mountains in Saskatchewan, but there was these ranges of hills that had a gap between them. And when the settlers came through the gap, that was the view that they had. And so that whole, it was originally at one point in time called Gapview School District. And there were, several dozen farm families that lived in that area. I think there's now one or two farmers that basically farm that entire section. So anyhow, it was the Gapview district, and so we always, when people said locally, where do you live? We say, well, we live in the Gap, or we live in Gapview.
Oh, wow.
In Gapview.
I never knew that. I thought it was all about just business and finding, what is the gap from where you are to where you want to be. I had no idea it had to do with your
And so the interesting thing is, back in 2007, when I first started had my first run at consulting, I said, oh, well, it's kind of cool. I'll just call it Gapview, right? Because it relates back to the farm. And,
love that.
And it's sort of, maybe kind of has some business applications.
Mm-hmm.
And then as we started to build the practice and the work, Gapview became the core. And I really didn't think about that or realize that at the time that I selected the name. It was more harken back to some extent my dad and my memories of growing up on the farm. But it turns out that it's actually pretty intuitive in terms of how a consulting practice or a business support practice like ourselves can help organizations understand their gaps, identify them, agree on them, and figure out solutions.
Yeah, because sometimes when you're too close to a project, you don't see. You have blinders on. You don't see the issues, or you choose to lie to yourself about the issues. That you really do need that third-party, unbiased opinion to look at numbers, to look at processes, and just say in a clear, concrete, view of what they're actually seeing.
Yeah, and to ask the hard questions. I've decided that. And this is based on some feedback I've had from folks we've worked with, that one of the best talents we have, my partner John Cloyne, we work together on a lot of projects, but I think one of the talents we have is to ask the hard questions. There's a lot of questions and I know this from running my own business, there's a lot of questions that you just tend to want to kind of avoid because you don't really want to know the answers.
Right.
You don't ask them to yourselves. You don't ask them to your employees. You're afraid to ask your customers for feedback on certain things because you're afraid what they're going to actually say.
No one wants to hear rejection. Everyone wants to think about social media. We're never posting the bad things or spilling coffee on a shirt. You're only showing how beautiful the shirt looked before the coffee spilled.
Go to your LinkedIn post and try to find posts where people say, I just had an engagement with a customer and it completely failed. I failed. They hated what I did, and everything was a disaster. Those kind of posts are pretty hard to find on LinkedIn. I guarantee you, as we're sitting here today, those kinds of experiences are happening everywhere.
Yeah, and they would probably get the most engagement and impressions if they were to actually be honest with that. So I'm very curious, obviously. What would be an example of a hard question you ask?
So one of the questions I love to ask is, when was the last time or what was the worst thing a customer said about you and your practice in your business in the past 6 months?
Okay, well, thank you for saying 6 months. It's been a good 6 months. But I don't know. I'd have to look back. Yeah. Interesting.
So because, we all love to bask in the glory, right? Yeah. We all love to bask in the compliments and the positive feedback. And sometimes we have this tendency when we get this bad comment, bad feedback, we just kind of set it aside a little bit because it doesn't match up with our vision of with our reality, right?
Yeah.
But it's those kinds of opportunities that are the nuggets and the gold that you can mine to really understand where you have opportunities for improvement. So what's the most negative thing a customer has said
Yeah.
to you and about your organization in the past 6 months?
That's a tough one, though.
And
Now it's starting to come back. I'm like thinking of other emails I've gotten.
And sometimes it's a great thing because a lot of times that kind of feedback doesn't filter up to the leadership level. So a lot of times you don't really uncover those until you get teams together, people that are within 50 feet of where the work is being done, that really understand what's going on. So that's an interesting, tough question. The other issue is, great sort of hard question is, how do you actually feel every day when you're finished work? Tell me about when you're driving home, or if you're working, you're closing up your computer. How do you feel?
Tired.
And if people are honest with themselves, feeling burnt out, I'm just stressed out, I didn't get everything done I wanted to do.
Yeah.
All of those kinds of things are probably a reflection of there's something going on, and it's not just because everyone's working so hard that you just can't get all the work done. A lot of times it's because there's something about the way work flows through your business, work is structured in you. The fact that you haven't clarified who your ideal customer is, so you're doing a bunch of stuff for people or for organizations that aren't really a match for you, and that creates problems in the organization. If you're feeling so stressed out and burnt out every day when you're closing up your computer or you're driving home from work, it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be that way. And there's ways of figuring that out. So some of those soft issues can be really important questions to drill
And with
down
that
into
one
as well.
too, like, again, I always like to think of duration of measurement, because days like today where I get to have these conversations, it just fills me up. Like, I end the day just feeling on such a high, but then there are some days when you're just working, grinding. Maybe you're just tired or a little burnt out. And so do you look at, again, at like a runway of a month, a runway of 2 weeks? What would be that runway to get a good average of how you actually are feeling?
I think that most of us will be honest. We'll set our own runway.
Yeah.
So, in general, how do you feel? Like, well, I felt great today, but in general.
The average.
The average day. How are you feeling are you feeling positive about everything that happened, or are you just? And another great question is, how do you think your employees are feeling? Yeah, because I might feel great.
Right?
Because I'm just pushing everything
on them and burning them out.
How do you think your employees are feeling every day when they go home from work? Gosh, I don't know. Maybe you should find out. I mean, there might be some gold there, right?
Totally. I know a couple of years ago we started implementing quarterly reviews.
Right.
And some of those reviews are just, how are you?
Right.
How are you feeling? Are you, we just want to know, like, are you enjoying? Are there things that I could be doing to make your life better, happier,
Yeah. And the best conversations you're going to have with an employer are not the ones where you pull out the spreadsheets and the dashboards and start to go through. It's the ones where you fold all that stuff up and say, how are you doing today?
Yeah, having those human connections, because at the end of the day, without people, you can only go so far in a business, and you really got to take care of those people and make sure that they're feeling fulfilled and taken care of and so forth.
The other great question to ask an employee is, what can we do to make this better? I did a podcast with Derek Maines. I don't know whether you know Derek or not, but
not yet.
Derek from the Process Fixer. And we talked about this. I ran a manufacturing business back in the late 90s. And I was a sales guy coming into an operations situation, I think because the company that owned the business thought we were going to fail, and they didn't want to spend a bunch of money on a professional operations person to come in. So we'll put Paul in there for a few months. It'll probably fail, and we'll just close down the plant, right? And so I didn't know really anything about running a manufacturing business. So all I did, I went out to the supervisors and the lead hands, and I asked that question: we're not doing very well here. What can we do to make it better? And a lot of times they'd never been asked that question before.
Yeah.
And first of all, they were stunned that anyone would actually cared, right? But then when they believed that the leadership team was actually willing to listen to him, the volume of suggestions and willingness to really people don't want to do a bad job.
No, yeah.
They want to do a good job. They want to enjoy their work every day when they show up. And so if you have people that you feel, well, they're just not engaged, it's because your system is not allowing them to do a good job, right?
Yeah.
So anyhow, bottom line was we implemented a whole bunch of stuff that came up from the people that were within 50 feet of doing the work. And we turned the facility around from losing money to making money. And that's how I became a hero. That's how I ended up with this vice president's job in the U.S. was all of a sudden I was a hero. And they thought, oh, wow, we'll make him a vice president. But anyhow, just ask your people, what can we do around here to make things better? And you'll be surprised what comes out of it.
Yeah, because people want to feel valued. Like you said, that people want to innately do a good job. And so the more that you can help them do that, I feel like so many times I do hear fellow business owners go, oh, I shouldn't have hired them. Or, oh, I don't want to hire because, no one's going to care as much as I care. But perhaps if we have that radical clarity of what our goals are and then getting that input from people, we can then help them, rise to the occasion.
Yeah. Once again, I work a fair bit with Derek over at the Process Fixer, and he's a student of W. Edwards Deming, and as a result, I've become a student of it as well. And one of Deming's comments has always been, a bad system beats a good person every day.
Ooh, okay, yeah.
So you can hire the best people that are out there, and everyone wants to do that. And it's important to get as good a match to the kind of position you have in your organization as you want. But if you throw those good people into a bad system that where they feel frustrated, where work doesn't flow, where they don't have the information they need to be able to do their jobs properly, where they can't connect with the other people in the organization to move business through properly, and where there's not clarity about, I got a customer with this problem, how do I solve it? Where when I have a customer with a problem, we don't change the system so that problem doesn't occur. All of those things that reflect that I've got a good system, right? If all of those things are happening, I've got a good system. If those things aren't happening, then I don't care how good your employees are, they're going to be frustrated, and eventually they're going to disengage. And you're going to say, that guy's not really doing it. Well, he was good when you hired him. You thought he was a great match.
Yeah.
Why was he not successful? Well, turn the mirror around and look at what you created in your organization for your employees to work in. Look at the system that you've asked them to work in. And maybe the problem is not the employee on the floor. Maybe the problem's in the mirror.
Mm-hmm. It's good. Yeah. And so it's all about being, totally truthful and having those uncomfortable conversations with yourself. That's true. This whole conversation has really reminded me of a book I've been listening to, Essentialism. Only focusing on what's essential. In the 14th century, we only had the word priority, one singular priority. And
there was no plural version.
There was no plural version of priorities because you could only focus on one thing at a time. I would love to know, what are some books that you have read or listened to that, have really just helped with your philosophy around business?
Well, so I've got to give my buddy Derek Maines a plug. He has a book called The System. So leaders who want to think about, how can I make my system better for the employees? That's a great place to start. So that's one great book. I love, and so there's 3 systems in every organization that have to work together effectively. You have a revenue system, your delivery, whatever value it is, how you process people and technology work together, and then your guidance system. So on the revenue system side, I've read and reread a couple of times this last year. I think it's Donald Miller, StoryBrand.
Oh yeah.
Oh, StoryBrand is such a great.
That's a good one.
And it's really been helpful to me as, we started GapView. I thought we were going to do this, and now we're doing this, and I'm a lot comfortable with really focusing on just transformations.
Nice.
And it was the StoryBrand reread of StoryBrand that helped me think through, what is the story about Gap View and who are our heroes that we can guide, and what problems and challenges are we actually helping them to solve. So I think that's a great book for every leader to read as well.
Yeah.
I'm also going to promote another local author, a fellow by the name of Rick McPartland, who wrote The Revenue System, or the Smartrev. I'm sorry.
Smartrev. I'm reading
Smartrev.
that book right now too. I should know the title. Smartrev.
and we leverage some of our work off of Rick's thinking as well. That's another book by a local author. I like to connect with folks, locally, or so you have the big books that everyone reads, right? Atomic Habits. That's a really good book. Yes, that's a good one. But, I like to connect with folks that have, who maybe don't have big distributions. Some of our local authors here in the business community are really, really good, and I highly recommend doing some research in those areas. But yeah, Rick's book, Derek's book have been really helpful to me as we build out how do we at GapView help companies.
Yeah. So if you were to write a book, what would be the title of that tale?
Oh gosh, I don't know. How to turn frequent failure into a good life.
Okay.
Because I feel like I've failed a lot more than I've succeeded. My successes have been sufficient to achieve a reasonable standard of living. But I feel like it's around the whole concept of every failure has an opportunity for you to create a transformation, and how do you use that to transform your life? And I think that if I was to write a book, it might be about that. Either that, or I might just write a book about jazz.
Nice. I'm sure you can weave some jazz into it, for the audio version, the audio book, every little transition into a new chapter or something.
Yeah.
But they do say people learn more from failures. If you can truly look back at it, in a concrete way, you learn more from your failures than you do your successes. Because successes just feel good. You don't really look back at your success and go, how did I get there? But you surely take the time to look back at a failure and go, what happened? How did we get there?
Right.
So
let me talk a little bit about jazz.
Oh, yes.
just so, and in relation to business. So,
okay.
I didn't really start playing jazz until I was in my teens. When I was younger, I played a lot of classical music. A lot of people don't associate the saxophone as a classical instrument, but there's a whole set of classical literature, classical music literature written for the saxophone. And I studied there, and I studied quite intensely, and I got to be very good. And of course, classical music is different from jazz in that, everything's written on the page, the crescendo, the staccatos, everything. And so good classical musicians are really good at playing what's written on the page. Jazz is completely different, right? Jazz, you sketch out a lead sheet, you write in the chord progressions, you maybe figure out a few harmonies here and there, you get a group together and you play, and then you improvise.
And you just jam.
And it's different every time, right?
Yeah.
Whereas classical music, the objective is to make it beautiful. When you go to hear Tchaikovsky, you expect it to sound this way, right? And so the objective is to recreate, and it is beautiful. It's beautiful. Jazz is completely different. It's like you're going to hear this same group play the same thing, 2 nights in a row. It's going to be completely different. I used to when I was younger say, well, I'm a jazz musician. I like creating stuff. I like improvising. And that's why I want to be an entrepreneur instead of a corporate guy. And then it dawned on me that said, we can't all be playing jazz in a business.
Right.
It's like some improvisation is okay, but that improvisation needs to happen within a structure that everyone has agreed on, that everyone knows how to operate within, that everyone understands where their improvisations, fit in, and where the boundaries are for their own individual improvisations. So running a successful business is like finding this combination between classical, and jazz. So you need to have enough structure that everyone understands how to play within that system, right? But you need to leave enough opportunities for creativity and improvisation so you can discover what the next level is. So that if you have a customer that comes to you with a problem that you haven't solved before, you can figure out, do we have the capacity to solve that problem or not? Do we?
Right.
So you have to have
the tempo of the already established flow, right?
So leaders, if they think about that with their organization, how do I find that balance between the structure, which is the classical part of the music in my organization, and the jazz, which is the improvisational opportunity for us, for our organization to innovate and create and move forward. So
I think that's your book there. I think there's
that maybe
I think there's a book there. Yeah, I love that. I can already just hear some stories behind, classical music versus jazz, and then that integration into business. That was beautifully said.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
So if someone wants to get involved in the gap view, or perhaps just get a general baseline idea of what their gaps are, what would be the first step you would tell people to do?
So go to our website. We have the very first thing you see on our website is a link to something we call the Gap View Enterprise Systems Check. And it's a 12-statement kind of best practice statement where we ask the respondents to evaluate each of these, what we think are key statements about running their business, based on two criteria. One is, how important is it to the success of your business, and how well are we doing? And if you complete that, you get a little report that shows your gaps, and that's your version of what the gaps are.
Yeah.
But we find that initial engagement creates some great opportunities to have a conversation about whether or not we can help you. And if we can't, at the very least, it's maybe caused you to ask yourself some questions.
I'm sure a lot of entrepreneurs, we don't take that time to reflect, to sit and reflect. And so at the very least, it'd give you an opportunity to sit and reflect and think about it. And, similar to how you can only measure success with your own yardstick, same thing with the gaps. One business isn't going to have the same type of gaps as another business. Yeah.
So we use that as a way of initiating a conversation with folks to see whether or not there might be some opportunities for us to help them out.
All right. Well, we'll make sure we have a link to that in the show notes. So make sure that you take a look and go to Gap View and take that free assessment, because it's free, and all it is going to do is at least give you some clarity at the very least. And so if you were to leave our audience with one bit of advice, one action item to do today, what would that be?
Running a business should not be a grind. Have the courage to understand and address the problems in your business, because in the end, it'll just be a lot more fun.
Yes. Yeah. Life is supposed to be fun. It's too short not to have fun. And so make sure you take a look at Paul and the Gap View and take your free assessment and just start seeing where your gaps are and what could be done in order to close the gap and reach to your goals. Thank you again for joining me today.
Oh, thank you, Taylor. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you for watching Tales with Taylor. Please make sure you like and subscribe to the Financial Potion YouTube channel to never miss an episode.